Hello and welcome to another tutorial in my series Exploring Watercolour with me, Charles Pierson. This tutorial will focus on this painting of a summer's day, and we'll be looking at how to create those clouds and then contrasting that with the darker trees on the horizon, the foreground textures and some reflections in the river. So I hope you enjoy it and find it informative. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me a line in the comments or indeed through the email, which the details of which are shown in the text below the video. So I'm starting by having drawn a simple sketch of the outline of the river and the horizon, just wetting the paper all over so that will help with the diffusing of the colours into the sky and create sort of soft cloud shapes and allow the colours to run together in a random fashion, using a 100% cotton, in this case cold pressed paper. When you use watercolour papers, the 100% cotton papers do give a much better effect in terms of absorbing the water and the paint and giving that lovely sort of diffused look that creates those random effects, which are particularly appealing when it comes to creating skies. So with the paper still wet, I'm using the side of a medium-sized brush just to give a little bit of inconsistency to the brush stroke so that it skips and we get this sort of effect of the blue sky and white of the clouds caused by the brush skipping across the surface of the paper. Using the side of a brush in this way, it's quite a good way of creating a more random brush stroke. So I'm just trying to give the idea that there's a bit of blue sky up above, then with just creating the shape of the edge of a cloud. And what I will then do is bring in some greys of the shadow of the underside of a cloud. It's actually quite interesting if you study pictures of clouds to see how they're formed, see how the shading from the sun creates shadows underneath. That will help to give a more realistic effect of the sky. I'm not claiming that I'm particularly doing that particularly well here, but it's always something to try and improve on when one's creating skies, is to look at the cloud structure, that fluffy clouds, and then they get smaller towards the horizon. The underside of clouds is where the shadow is, so that's where they're darker. And what I'm doing here, I'm trying to just leave some white space between the blue of the sky and the edge of the cloud, so we get that feeling of a sort of three-dimensional cloud. To maintain the color harmony in the clouds, I'm using really just two colours here, cobalt blue and neutral tint, uh, and with the white of the paper doing the work of the creating the bright edges of the clouds, and just trying to keep things random by using the size of the brushes and different size brushes as we go along. It's the different intensity of the color will give the sort of modulation of the light and shade. So even though we're only using a couple of colors here, by using darker tones and lighter tones together and mixing a bit of the colors together as well, you can still create a significant amount of variation in the clouds. As the paper's still pretty wet, just touching a loaded paintbrush onto the surface of the paper will absorb the paint and run into random patterns, which is obviously a very useful effect when one's trying to create the randomness of clouds. And just using different size brushes to create these sort of more random effects. I'll be using a small brush to just touch in a few um, shadowy areas rather than using a large brush, which would perhaps create large blocks of the same color. Using a small brush or the side of a brush just to create irregularities is a good way of creating the randomness that one sees in the clouds. Right, having done most of the sky, or at least for the first wash, as you will see later in the tutorial, I decided to go back and darken some of those sky areas because as the paint dried, it got lighter as it always does. Now, if your particular version of this, if you're happy with the depth of colour you've got in the sky already, no need to feel the need to go back in. But very often in watercolours, it's quite difficult to gauge how light something's going to look after it's dried, and it's therefore, especially in my tutorials, you'll often see me re-wetting the paper and applying colour again. And that's because, A, sometimes when it's dried, I think, oh yeah, it needs to be darker. Or it may simply be that I painted for 10 or 15 minutes and then I went away, did something else, came back, the paper dried, and then I had to re-wet it anyway. But that's something to always bear in mind. You can re-wet the paper and then reapply paint and get that same similar effect of sort of wet in wet painting. So here I'm starting to add in some of the darker horizon trees. Paper's still a little bit damp, so they're sort of giving a nice soft blurred effect as they run into the sky. And I wanted to add the trees at this stage to give a sort of idea of how dark they should look against the sky. Traditionally, uh, watercolorists work from light to dark, which is very sensible because one can't paint light over dark very easily in watercolor. Um, but it doesn't mean to say that you always have to wait till the very last bits of the painting to add the darkest dark. Sometimes it's useful to put some dark tones in just to get a gauge for where the value range should be. That's what I'm doing here, because you'll see as I move on to the foreground, I'll be going back to lighter colors and then going back over those with darker colors again. It really doesn't matter, provided one is aware of the fact that you need to, um, any particular area of the painting that you want to keep light to do so. And if you want to add darks later, that's fine, but you can't do it the other way around. If you go too dark, it's very difficult to then lighten an area afterwards. So now moving on from the tree line down to the main parts of the land where I'm blocking in the colours in sort of larger sweeping motions of the brush with the yellow ochre and raw sienna, which I will then add further darks to as we progress. Now adding some darks to the edges of the where the water and the land meet to make the edge of the land stand out against the lighter tones of the water. Here I'm using a fan brush to give a sort of spiky effect to some of the foreground grasses, darker colours again, and just helping to give a little bit of texture and different tone texture to the foreground, so it's not all one colour, not all one type of brush stroke. So that gives extra added interest to the painting. Now moving on to the water, I could have painted the water first and then added the land around it, but because really the two things are quite separate here, it's fine to just go back in and re-wet the area where the water is, and just start adding in some colours from the sky, sort of the blues and greys of the sky for reflections. So create that effect of a reflective water surface. And once again, as the paper had dried a little bit, I've just re-wet with a mop brush, and then that'll enable me to give the effect of the sort of reflections of the dark riverbanks seeping down into the water. So I'm creating a sort of soft wet and wet approach here with the side of a rigger brush with load of some dark paint. That will bleed down into the recently wet water surface, which gives a more pleasing, so you don't get any harsh transitions between the dark and the light of the water. So here we are moving on to the main trees, just using a small brush with some dark paint, skipping over the surface using the side of the brush to give a broken foliage effect rather than having a solid mass of colour. Then that is a more effective way of creating the feel of foliage of the sky showing through the clumps of leaves. Having created the trees, now time to make some reflections. So I'm just dragging some paint down and then sort of sweeping across it to give the effect of a hazy reflection in the water. Um, there are several ways of approaching reflections, but this is quite an effective way of doing it. Don't want anything too precise. It's just to give the effect of a distant shadow, a different reflection in the water. So having stood back and looked at the painting, I thought the sky could do with being a bit darker. So I re-wet the sky and reapplying some blues and the darker greys to enhance the shadows on the clouds. So that concludes the tutorial. I do hope that you found it helpful. And as I said at the start of the video, if there are any questions, just drop me a line in the comments or send me an email. And I will leave you with just a little look of how that painting might look like if it was framed. There's just a digital mock-up representation, but I think sometimes it's nice to see what the final painting could look like when it's framed. So that's that, and until next time, enjoy your painting, and I hope that you will be able to revisit this channel to see another tutorial in due course. Bye for now.